Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, CAR-T Approval, What's Next? I'm Heidi Hagen. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer and co-founder of Vanetti, and we are developing a digital platform for cell and gene therapies. Just a quick background regarding me, relevancy to the topic. I spent 10 years at Dendreon, was a Senior Vice President of Operations for Dendreon, and brought the operations for both the U.S. and Europe to the market in 2010 with the FDA approval of Provenge. I am thrilled to be here to present and moderate in this webinar today. And with the two CAR-T therapies that are now approved, this is a pivotal time for these innovative medicines. The purpose of today's discussion is to talk about what's next for CAR-T from the perspective of some of the key communities involved with them. And with that, I'm going to ask that each of the panelists introduce themselves and give a little bit of a background. Gwen, let's start with you.
Hello, I'm Dr. Gwen Nichols. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. I'm a hematologist-oncologist by training. I had a career as an academic hematologist-oncologist where I taught, had a laboratory, and took care of patients. After that, I ran the translational medicine group at Roche Oncology in New York. And this past year, was offered the position of Chief Medical Officer at the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society. Of course, because the CAR-T therapies are approved in the patients that we serve at LLS, we are very interested in helping our patients access these innovative therapies. But more importantly, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society has been funding the research for CAR-T therapy as long ago as 20 years when we first funded Dr. Carl June's efforts at the University of Pennsylvania, and we continue to fund these types of therapies and new innovations for CAR-T. So I look forward to our discussions.
Thank you, Gwen. Bruce, can you go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience?
Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Bruce Thompson. I'm the Senior Scientific Director of the Therapeutic Products Program here at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center. The TPP is the Therapeutic Products Program acronym. It's the clinical manufacturing arm here at the Fred Hutch, and we're really involved in translational research to phase 1 clinical studies, and I've been recruited here very recently to help them get the basic science out of the research lab and into the clinic to help benefit patients. Prior to my joining the Fred Hutch, I was at Pfizer Biologics for about 10 years, really learning some of the finer art of biologics development, antibody drug conjugates, monoclonal antibodies, and over the last several years, cell therapy. So I've been able to translate a lot of the traditional biologics development and manufacturing activities into the new cutting-edge cell therapy field. I look forward to the discussion today.
Thank you, Bruce. Michael, can you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. My name is Michael Werner. I am the co-founder and executive director for the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine. The Alliance is a multi-stakeholder group of about 270 cell therapy, gene therapy, tissue engineering, regenerative medicine, and related companies, large and small, as well as research foundations, patient advocacy groups, and investors, all of whom came together to work on policy and educational efforts to try to commercialize regenerative medicine, cell and gene therapy, and advanced therapy products to get into the hands of patients as soon as possible. My day job is that I am a lawyer at the law firm of Holland & Knight. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I co-chair the Health and Life Sciences team, and my practice involves working with mostly FDA-regulated companies on regulatory, reimbursement, and other issues. I have particular expertise in the issues around cell and gene therapy and regenerative medicine, and look forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Michael. And for the last but not least, Patricia Reilly will give us a CAR-T primer. If you could introduce yourself, and then I will advance a slide for the audience.
Great, thanks. My name is Patricia Reilly, and I'm the Vice President of Intelligence Alliances for Pharma. Pharma has a collaborative partnership with the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, and I work closely with ARM to track advances in the advanced therapies as they move through development and also offer in-depth analysis and data in this space. So as Heidi mentioned, we will explore the first historic approval of a CAR T therapy and what that means for the patient community, as well as how the scientific, clinical, policy, and business communities will approach issues surrounding CAR T. Since there's hopefully a broad range of participants dialing in today, we thought we'd start before our panel discussion with to take a moment and review what CAR T therapy is and why it's important and where we're headed. So CAR T therapy is very unique as it's considered a cell therapy, a gene therapy, and an immunotherapy simultaneously, making it incredibly different from any other type of medicine. The novel approach takes advantage of the human body's own defense mechanism, the immune system, to help fight disease. Simply put, the patient's own T cells are isolated from the patient's blood. The cells are modified with chimeric antigen receptor genes, or CAR genes, that are directed against the patient's tumor type. This alteration changes the native receptors on the outside of the T cells, making them express a chimeric receptor specific for a particular cancer-associated antigen or protein. The modified cells are then reintroduced into the patient. The chimeric receptors act with the specificity of a monoclonal antibody and direct the T cell to its target. So in a cancer indication, the engineered cells will recognize and kill cancerous cells, as well as reactivate other immune cells that have been diminished by the cancer's inhibitory signals. So the Novartis drug, Rhea, enables the modified T cells to express a chimeric T cell receptor targeted to the surface CD19 molecule, which is a marker on B cells. Additionally, in December of 2016, the 21st Century Cures Act was passed, and this legislation created a special designation pathway, which is an accelerated approval pathway similar to the FDA's breakthrough status. The Regenerative Medicine Advanced Therapy, or REMAT designation, is given to regenerative medicines involved in cell therapy and tissue engineering products. Therefore, CAR T therapies can be considered for this designation. There are now 9 therapies currently in clinical development that have been granted the REMAT designation, and 1 is pending. In Europe, the EMA passed regulations back in 2007 to review advanced therapies, and we're now beginning to see a number of these products move through these special designations. Novartis has proposed an outcome-based reimbursement for their treatment, meaning that efficacy in a patient will be key towards pricing and reimbursement. And this concept could be a step forward in handling and accounting for regenerative medicines moving forward. However, Kite has not discussed a value-based arrangement, and their price doesn't include the cost of leukapheresis, the process used to extract the patient's T cells. So reimbursement will continue to be an extremely important topic as the sector moves forward. And lastly, right now, the answers to some really important issues need to be resolved, such as ensuring sustainable, reliable, scalable manufacturing for autologous T cells, what % of the patients will be cured, how many years will a treatment be effective for, determining whether CAR T can be used in solid tumors, and what's next on the CAR T market. So as Heidi mentioned, we're right at the doorstep of an exciting time for medicine and treatments of patients, and so hopefully we'll get to discuss all of these topics today. And as I hand this back over to Heidi, I just want to remind you that you can send questions in, and we'll get to them at the end of the session. Thanks, Heidi.
Great, thank you. And as Patricia mentioned on the lower half there, be sure to send in your questions for the panelists over the time of this webcast, another housekeeping item is that for those of you that registered for the webinar, you will be made available the slides from this presentation and this discussion. So we'll go ahead and get into the discussion, and we will go ahead and start with our first question. Make sure we have there we go. Each of you represents distinct areas of expertise and stakeholder perspective in this arena. Can you please provide insights into what the medical availability of these therapies, mean? Oh, I am actually back. Sorry, it advanced one more than I realized there. My apologies. Into the medical availability of these therapies means to you and the communities you represent. So, Bruce, why don't we go ahead and start with you? If you could go ahead and comment, it'd be a great start for us.
Sure. Thanks, Heidi. I think, being a representative here at the Fred Hutch, the availability of new therapeutic drugs is always great for patients. For the particular CAR-T therapies we're talking about now, obviously it's a great option for those who have relapsed refractory ALL, NHL, particularly in the pediatric setting with Novartis's Rhea. I think what's fantastic for our patients here at the Hutch is that as a regional medical center, we have a lot of expertise, and we're moving very quickly to implement these new commercial assets, new commercial CAR-T therapies. What's really interesting, though, is that it emboldens, I think, the research community as well. So anytime there is a new market approval of a new sort of groundbreaking therapy, it highlights the need for more research. And I think that's a positive across the entire research community. One of the things that we're particularly interested in with the CAR-Ts is the next sort of generation. We're on to second, third generation CAR-Ts. There's a lot of research looking at multiple receptors, combining different antigens, and I think this will open the door to new targets, in particular solid tumors. And so I think with the approval of the new CAR-T therapies, as we generate more data on their efficacy, on their longevity, on their true mechanisms of action in a much wider patient population, that will enable us to then step into these new frontiers with respect to solid tumors and new indications. It may also allow for greater utilization in the patient population so that it's not third, fourth, fifth line therapy. It moves a little bit forward in the treatment regimen. Again, that will depend on a number of factors, but I think it's a really exciting time to watch the progression of these therapies. I also think it's an opportunity for us to better understand the manufacturing challenges. So as you can imagine, doing a phase 1 or a phase 2 clinical trial in a relatively controlled setting with inclusion-exclusion criteria gives you a good opportunity to understand how a drug may work. Knowing that this is a living drug, these cells replicate inside of the patients, I think we've gained a lot of information from our early clinical studies. But I think as we broaden access to patients, there's really a need for an enhancement in chain of custody, making sure that a patient in an autologous setting gets their own cells back is obviously critical. There's been a lot of advancement in the software and in the tracking space to make sure that the logistics are available to ensure patient material gets to a manufacturing site. Those cells get engineered appropriately and then cryopreserved or sent back to the patient bedside for dosing. So I think the more that the industry does this, the more that we get those activities sort of under our belt, the better we will become. There'll be new innovations to support those logistics. And I think as we again get more experience in the manufacturing space, we'll begin to understand when a patient's cells may or may not expand appropriately. I think we heard anecdotally that there are a small number of failures in the pivotal trials for Novartis, and I assume for Kite, but those will be minimized as we gain more experience in that manufacturing arena.
Yes, it's going to be interesting. There's a great proof of concept, as you mentioned here, to really kind of push forth the next set of tools that involve, second generation CAR-Ts or genetic engineering tools. I think that there's just a tremendous opportunity to create other platforms and engineering tools. So it's a great proof of concept. I think it also opens the door, for enabling patients to be more engaged in personally fighting their disease. Gwen, maybe you could comment a little bit on that and some of the other points you have.
Certainly, and I couldn't agree more that I think this is the tip of the iceberg in terms of where the research needs to go, and we are certainly supporting not only next generation CAR T, but cellular therapies in general, because I think where we need to go not only earlier, but we need to understand who are the patients who respond and why. I think this will have a great deal of impact because when patients hear about these successes, they're anxious to have access to these therapies, but we desperately need to know some of the information about who is likely to respond, for whom do we see the greatest chance of benefit versus adverse events, and then before we get overly enthusiastic about moving it forward, we need to know how we combine immune therapies with our standard therapies and with targeted therapies so that we have a holistic approach to the patient, not what unfortunately is oftentimes over the history of science and technology, everybody get on board with the newest thing and not continue to do a broader type of science to understand the biology behind it so that we can apply this most effectively. Biomarkers, the immunome, to know who responds and what makes it so that we can expand this to solid tumors and treat the right patients. This is critical because these are going to be expensive and cumbersome therapies. Are there efforts we can do to make this easier, more efficient, and faster? And I think that that's where patients can really play a role in pushing that forward. LLS also supports access to the clinical trials for these types of therapies, and I think that patients who are interested in finding out where the next generation of CAR T and other cellular therapies are being tested can contact the LLS Information Resource Center and get a one-on-one personalized navigation to find those trials and to have access to these therapies.
Yeah, it's going to be a great opportunity for patients to be engaged, involved, and I think, if there's also the additional aspects of the investment that can be put into the field now that the proof of concept has come through. And Michael, perhaps you can talk a bit on this, from an ARM perspective, our Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, that this is a critical aspect in addition to patient engagement, is engagement from other areas where we can continue to push these forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, of course, everything that my colleagues have said is 100% right in terms of the fundamental changes this means in terms of patient engagement, in terms of the biology that we're learning, in terms of understanding future challenges and understanding and providing a way for patients to have some more control over their treatments. All of that is 100% true. I think that what you just hit on is also really important, which is that one of the other ways that the approval of these technologies will really impact the future is that they really open the door for the next round of technological advances. By that I mean by getting these products in the hands of doctors and ultimately the patients, what that does is it really opens the door for new cell therapies or gene therapies or genetically modified cell therapies, or all these different kinds of targeted therapies that might have durable and even potentially curative impacts to get to the market. And the proof of principle here is critical, because what we know about the way biomedical research and commercialization works is that when it becomes clear that there's a pathway to scientifically bring a safe and effective product to patients, that just spurs more innovation, it just spurs more investment, and it spurs more people trying to go down the same route, because these CAR Ts have demonstrated that if you've got good data and you've got good science, biologically, let's say, you've been able to prove to the FDA that you can develop a safe and effective product that's going to have this kind of impact on patients. And that means that if you are the next researcher, next product developer, you now know that this is doable. And you now know that it's doable from the FDA's perspective. And so that means that kind of is a jolt in the arm for future work. And something that was alluded to at the beginning, I think by Patty, the way that the products are being paid for and are being reimbursed, I think that's also very significant, because it demonstrates that when we've got these new kinds of products, we're going to have to think about what the financing is going to look like, what the reimbursement is going to look like. And again, what we've seen with these first CAR Ts is that, in fact, those are problems that are difficult but solvable. And we've seen CMS, for example, expressing a willingness to think outside the box and try to work with all the stakeholders to try to make those things happen. So I think you really, in addition to the therapeutic options and the number of lives saved and all of those things that we've been talking about this morning, I think you really can't understate or underestimate the importance of these approvals in terms of, kind of triggering or being a catalyst for even more of this kind of potentially life-saving work.
Great. Anything else to add from anybody on the panel regarding the impact of the CAR T approvals before we move on? Okay, with that, I will move us to our next area, which commercializing these complex therapies means terrific opportunities and a fair deal of optimism, but also a fair share of challenges. What do you see as the most promising opportunity? And what are the challenges you see as most pressing? And how should we address these challenges? Michael, I'm going to go ahead and actually ask you if you could just go ahead and start with this one from your perspective.
Sure. So I think the opportunity is what we've been talking about, which is, the opportunity to change people's lives, people who may have had an illness or disability or what have you, that for which there was certainly no cure and perhaps no treatment, and certainly in the case of some of these products, people who didn't have a great prognosis in terms of being able to live very much longer. So the opportunities here are to be able to provide patients with a powerful new tool to fight cancer, to be able to have hope that they might in fact have a treatment and be able to live their lives. I think that the challenges are also what we've started to talk about, which is this is all really, really exciting and fascinating and breakthrough science, but we really need to make sure that the regulatory environment, the reimbursement environment exists to continue to facilitate the development of these products. So what do we mean by that? Well, what we mean is that we need to continue to have the FDA be willing to look at new ways for companies to demonstrate safety and effectiveness of their products. In no way should these be I'll phrase it this way. The gold standard is the FDA's approval process. Patients know that if a product is demonstrated to be safe and effective and the FDA verifies as such that, in fact, the product is safe and effective. And without that, patients and physicians will lose confidence in the system, and more importantly, patients will be at risk. So we have to make sure that the standards for approval remain strong and remain high, and that the FDA should only be approving products that have sufficiently demonstrated safety and efficacy. That said, with things like the new RMAT designation and even the other expedited approval programs from FDA, we've seen the agency and stakeholders be able to work together to try to find mechanisms that will make the process predictable, transparent, and efficient, so that when it is demonstrated that a product is safe and effective, it actually will be able to get to the market within a reasonable period of time, and that the agency is willing to work with sponsors to help them work through their challenges and be able to sort of get over that bar. The same is true on the reimbursement side. So we need to make sure that two things happen. The first is that our current health insurance system, which everybody on this webinar knows is kind of at best would be called fragmented, but is confusing and multi-pronged, and you've got public programs like Medicare and Medicaid, and you've got private insurance, and you've got employers who do their own self-insuring. So it's complicated, it's fragmented. We have to make sure that the insurance models that exist now can accommodate these new programs, right? These new products. So Rhea or the other products that have come forward that are being used, for example, in Medicare patients in hospitals, we have to make sure that the existing system does not provide any kind of disincentive for hospitals or physicians to be using these products if, in fact, those physicians feel like these products are critical to help their patients. So we've got these reimbursement systems that already exist that were not built for these kinds of technologies, right? They were not built for curative technologies. They were not built for technologies perhaps with a single administration that provides these durable benefits. So we've got to get them to accommodate these new technologies. Then the other thing we have to do is we have to think about new models, new ways to price drugs, new ways to reimburse products, so that we have a system going forward that does bring all these products in and does allow innovators to recoup their investment, that does incentivize providers to use these products, that does make them affordable for patients. And that is a longer-term objective, but it's an objective that our organization is working on. We work with every stakeholder you can imagine to try to make that happen, and it's only going to happen if patients and drug developers and insurers and providers all come to the table and try to figure out what's best for patients and what's going to work best for our system.
Yeah, so one of the challenges really is kind of this value-based approach to pricing and reimbursement that was introduced by Novartis and has been discussed by others. What are your thoughts on how something like that might actually practically work?
So it could work there's a couple different ways it could work, but certainly one way it could work would be that similar to what Novartis was working on with CMS, which is some kind of performance-based approach. So one way to think about this could be that the reimbursement system, the insurance system in the U.S. only pays for products that demonstrate their safety and efficacy, not just in the context of a clinical trial, but actually in the real world. So that might be one way of making sure that you're sort of paying for value, right? Because you only get paid if the product demonstrates that it's working. Another way to be thinking about that is, or another way that we have to think about that is, how do we define what value means? Because value can mean different things to different patients. It could mean different things to clinicians than patients, and certainly different things to a payer. And so how do we think about that? How do we think about how we measure the impact of a healthcare intervention, and that in order to determine its value, and therefore how much it should be paid for? Should we be thinking about the fact that what the upfront price is, because that's often the way our current system was built, or should we be thinking about the fact that there might be a high upfront cost, but we're saving so much money on the back end, right? So we're now just talking about the financial part. We're putting aside the importance of a patient and getting cured and all of those things. Not to minimize it, but I'm just talking about the value part here. So how do we talk about value? Well, it could be that there's a very expensive treatment on the front end, but that, this means a person isn't going to be in the hospital for, weeks on end, or have to go back into the hospital over and over and over, or have to get rounds and rounds and rounds of treatment, and maybe they can go back to work, and maybe they can, get their lives back. And that has a value too, some of which is quantifiable, some of which is not, or is perhaps harder to quantify. So I think the real challenge here going forward is, how do we define value, and then how do we measure healthcare interventions against that definition of value, so that we're incentivizing our system to be developing those interventions and to be using them.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge all around, and then I think also this challenge is to kind of link it into some of the other pieces we've been discussing, is really thinking about patient access and bringing to the additional patient populations. Gwen, your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the first steps in determining value are extremely helpful. So we applaud the efforts to ascertain value. I think for those of us who talk to patients frequently and hear these stories and meet the patients and take care of the patients who've gone through these therapies, it's very easy to see the value of a single therapy and a single point in time to a patient who had gone through all and exhausted all other options of having a remission and being able to return to normal life. In the pediatric setting, this is so obvious when kids get to go back to school. I saw recently in Texas a young girl who was able to go back to her cheerleading and go back to school and have a completely normal life of a 6-year-old. And this is priceless from our point of view. And so those kind of values compared with multiple stem cell transplants and multi-agent chemotherapy and long hospitalizations, I think the math is easier there. Where it gets harder, and where it's harder for us as an organization to see how we do these value propositions, and where we think more about it, is the intangibles, the things we don't know yet about how durable the responses are, how to determine in a population of relapsed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma patients or CLL patients who are older, and where the value of getting your normal life back is not as long as a 5-year-old. What is the value there versus what we're willing to pay and what the society is willing to pay? And I think until we have some more data, both on biomarkers of who will do best and who will not have adverse events, and then how long these therapies provide benefit, I think we have a long way to go in terms of developing a value-based system that patients will understand. Access, as I mentioned earlier, is very important, and because these therapies have to be done at tertiary care centers and fairly limited number of centers at this time, LLS is really trying to assist in getting patients to these therapies when it is appropriate for them, which may include assisting them in travel and in finding the right place and in informing them about these therapies. But I think for us, we very much care about the cost of the care on the entire cancer continuum, and because this is going to be an expensive therapy by definition, and this is only one of many very cumbersome and technologically very intense and very complicated therapies, any research we can do to simplify this will have an impact on the ability to access this and therefore the cost and the value proposition for patients. And so it will be easier for us to know how to advocate for our patients in terms of encouraging them to obtain these types of therapies and to participate in trials for these therapies.
Yeah, so clearly the cost and the value and the let's call it the price tag for these therapies is higher than the average product, but part of the complexity of that is also the manufacturing processes, the logistics of which some of which you mentioned, Gwen. Bruce, could you perhaps comment on this? I think these are challenges that are naturally and inherently wrapped into CAR-T and other cell therapies.
Sure, Heidi, I would agree wholeheartedly. I'm going to flip the script a little bit and talk a little bit about those challenges a priori, and then maybe highlight how there are opportunities that could arise on an ongoing basis when we're able to surmount some of those challenges. The first is really the availability of a skilled labor force. So if you think historically about a biologic compound, a team of operators could make 1,000 doses or 5,000 doses at a time, because a typical monoclonal antibody in a bioreactor setting, you can simply make many more doses. That same team of operators now can make maybe 1 or 2 doses where each individual patient is an individual lot or an individual product. So just having the sheer number of available personnel to create these new cell therapy and gene therapy compounds is a challenge. I think that one of the things that we need to better understand is the ability to automate these manufacturing processes. You're starting to see that happen. As the industry matures, some of these processes are becoming shorter, and so that will help as well in the sheer labor aspects. So our ability to understand really at the end of the day what an effective CAR-T looks like. So, what sort of T-cell phenotype do we need? What sort of cell dose do we need? Is it patient dependent or is it manufacturing process dependent? Answering some of those challenges will actually give us a lot of opportunity now to then streamline the next generation of manufacturing processes, whether it's a shorter process, whether it's fully closed and automated. All of those things will work to drive down the cost of goods. The other challenge that I see really is scalability, right? So if you think about, again, a controlled clinical trial in the phase 2 setting where you have 100 patients, that takes a lot of effort and a lot of investment from either a biotech or a large pharma in the development space. Now scaling that to several thousand or tens of thousands of patients is really going to be a hard task for just about anybody. And so again, it comes down to logistics and scheduling. When patient material arrives, when cell culture activities are available, what if there's a shortage in media or serum? These are all challenges that I think we're going to face over the next few months to years. And it will take some bumps in the road to then figure out how to fix the things that are broken in that supply chain. But I do think that overcoming those challenges will really present a number of opportunities. As we begin to streamline manufacturing processes, I think we'll be able to answer some of the questions around in the manufacturing of material. Are we seeing patient-to-patient variability that impacts those processes? Or is it truly variability in raw materials or variability in operator expertise? I think removing some of those variabilities will then allow us to ask clinical questions. Do we need certain populations of T-cell to be present in the drug to make it effective. Once we learn those clinical questions, we can then iterate on the manufacturing process to make better next generation products. I think the other thing that it will allow us to do is to gain expertise in the clinical management of symptoms. When we know that we have a reliable, robust manufacturing process, and that's not leading to variability in patient-to-patient outcomes, we can then concentrate more on reacting to adverse events, understanding what cytokine release syndrome looks like, and being more able to quickly react to those sorts of things in the patient populations.
Yes, that makes a ton of sense. I think I will also add is that kind of linking together the patient access piece and the manufacturing pieces that have been discussed by several of us here today is really thinking about in today's world of digitization. You know, we walk around with cell phones and smartphones, and we have various other easy apps in the cloud. It's time for that to intersect with medicine in a way that really helps patients get connected to physicians, the right therapies, be able to have them ask the right questions, but also to bring down the costs of these complex therapies, essentially make them more simple. And I think that's something what we're doing at Vanetti, but I think it's something that's a partnership with the providers, with the manufacturers, with all parts of the value chain for these products. We have one more question in our slide deck for the panelists, and then I'd like to jump to the questions we've had come through the webcast. And we've actually been answering quite a few of those through the process, so that's good. We have a few that are unique that I'll come to. But the last question we have here, and I'll ask the panelists, we'll just quickly go through this so that we can each provide our views, but then we can maybe perhaps jump onto the questions we've been asked by our audience. What unique types of supports do these therapies need to ensure the regulatory and reimbursement environment are supportive? We've touched on some of these already, but I'm going to ask us to kind of wrap those pieces up and then maybe jump to the other questions as I discussed. So, Gwen, perhaps you could lead us off on this creating a supportive environment thought process.
Well, I think that my role in this will be the one of talking about the patient stories and what the value is to the individual of having the opportunity to get one of these therapies, and for those who have good responses, which is increasing in number and the safety is increasing, what value that brings to the patient for returning to their regular life. And I think that LLS, certainly as a patient-centered organization, is very well placed to be able to inform payers and the full regulatory agencies about the value that we are seeing, not at one institution or in one trial, but across all of these cellular therapies as we have contact with all of these patients who are participating. And I think we can advocate for both the cost and the simplification and the continued research into improving these therapies to make them simpler, to make them more accessible, and to make them available at a cost that's possible for our patients to access. So we certainly will be supporting this research with our research funding dollars because we see the benefit for patients.
Great. Michael, can you give us your thoughts?
Sure. Well, I thought that my colleague just gave a great, discussion about the value to the patient and in terms of getting their life back, and that's obviously, kind of essentially why everyone is talking about these therapies because of their potential to do just that and their potential to do it in a way that's perhaps through a single treatment or at least not, perhaps more efficiently for everybody and certainly easier for the patient. And I think we also have to, the the reimbursement environment, of course, also involves other stakeholders. So the payers have to understand the value of these therapies, and sometimes I think they look beyond just the value to the patient in terms of getting their life back, but they also very much feel like they have to be, paying for treatments that are effective and treatments that have lasting benefits and that might reduce other expenditures that they have. Certainly, physicians think about how they can do better by their patients and want to do better by their patients, and we have to make sure that they see the value of these products clinically as well as financially for them and for hospitals, especially if we think that there are going to be some upfront costs. So clearly, we need to have a conversation among all the stakeholders about how to talk about value, how to define it, and how to make sure it's part of the system, not just from a reimbursement perspective, but also from a regulatory perspective, because that's why we need to make sure that the regulatory environment is conducive to getting safe and effective products through the process as soon as possible. And as I said before, it's critical that the standards for safety and efficacy remain high and remain strong, but it's also important that the agency think about how it can work with patients and it can work with stakeholders and sponsors to try to make sure that their processes are transparent, that their processes are predictable, and that there are ways that the science can demonstrate safety and efficacy without going through the sort of full-blown process that takes so many years to develop. So I think really, as we've said, the opportunity is in front of us. There are challenges to be worked through, but the good news is I think that all of the stakeholders involved, including, by the way, the government, are anxious to work through these problems so that we can make sure patients get the benefits of these life-saving treatments.
Great, thank you. Bruce, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think standardization is really critical, and I think not only in understanding the supportive environment for the patients, but also the supportive environment for the developers and the interactions with regulators. So I view the cell and gene therapy field today much like the monoclonal antibody field 20 to 25 years ago. It's really in its infancy, and it took us a long time to harmonize a lot of things around production systems, around excipients for biologics, et cetera. If we can learn from those activities many years ago in the cell and gene therapy space, I think we'll get there a lot faster. And so having standardized testing approaches, knowing what's important to test and what's not important to test, having sort of off-the-shelf options for culture expansion, for cryopreservation, all these things I think will help speed the development of cell therapies, get them to patients faster, and perhaps simplify the manufacturing processes. And I think all of that really leads to the next question, which is as we iterate in our development cycles, the next generation of CAR-Ts will be made sort of cheaper, faster, and with more efficacy. The question is, how do we get to those innovative spaces collaboratively so that it's just not one company or one group sort of in the corner hoping they hit the right combination of things to make that next advancement. That's often the way science does work. But if we can do it collaboratively, I think we would be much better off. One example there is really the fact that many different CAR-T trials are made with different manufacturing processes. And so measuring safety across those different trials is confounded by the fact that each of those cell products were made in a slightly different way. So it's hard to tease apart anything that would be inherent to each individual product if they're made in a different fashion. So beginning to harmonize how you activate cells, how you introduce the CAR, and how you cryopreserve cells may be really beneficial across the board, not only in speed to patient, but also in the patient outcome space where we can have better expectations around how to manage those pieces. And I think finally, really understanding, the requirements with the regulatory agencies across both the U.S. and Europe. So as the FDA has a certain set of things they look for in an investigational new drug application for a new product, the EU and the EMA may have different expectations. They may be more liberal, they may be less liberal. It just depends really on which individual country you go to in Europe or which individual reviewer you get. And so having a little bit more standardization in the approach to development would be very beneficial, I think, for these new and cutting-edge therapies.
Great, and I think I will add from creating a supportive environment is there's finding ways to expand the care provider network capable of providing these new products. Clearly, we have life-saving, if not curative, products right now in the current approvals, but it's finding a way to go beyond the top centers that have the small network available to them and getting it out into various other parts of the United States and the world, which does lead us to some of the questions we had come through. Thank you from the audience who is participating today. And one of the questions we have is, what about other parts of the world? What do we need to do to expand to patients outside the United States? Michael, perhaps you can give us some thoughts from your perspective.
Well, one important thing is to make sure that regulatory bodies around the world have standards and requirements that are certainly consistent with each other, but in fact perhaps are even more harmonized, so that products that are being developed globally or need to be used globally are being subject to similar standards across the world. We certainly don't want to be in a situation where, number one, it's incredibly difficult for a product developer to develop a product in Europe versus in the United States, for example, because the regulatory bodies have completely different perspectives on how the product should be regulated and what the data requirements should be and what the standards are. But we also want to make sure that regulatory bodies around the world maintain very high standards for safety and efficacy. I would also say, while I raised sort of one concern about differing requirements, certainly another concern would be that some jurisdictions around the world that might not have as rigorous an approval process as, for example, the U.S. FDA does. That is certainly not going to be helpful for patients and potentially puts them at risk. And so in terms of around the world, I think we need strong standards of approval and consistency in the regulatory approach. I think when you're talking about reimbursement, that's a little more complicated because countries around the world have different ways of paying for medical interventions like new drugs or even new medical procedures. So that's a little bit more complicated, but I think it still is going to come down to value. And I think that it's still going to come down to how can patients and clinicians and product developers and researchers all work together to demonstrate value, because in every jurisdiction, no matter whether it's a government-run, health insurance system or some, hybrid of private insurance and government insurance or whatever, at the end of the day, people are still going to want to pay for value, and they're going to want to pay for significant clinical benefit.
Any other comments, Gwen or Bruce, on the subject?
So this is Bruce. I'll just add that I think the logistics of international CAR-T treatment will be challenging. Obviously, Novartis has taken that challenge up, and they've created manufacturing both in the U.S. and in Europe, and I think that will help tremendously offset some of the challenges of shipping a frozen cryopreserved drug product internationally. Again, I think the more we do this, the more we'll get comfortable with transiting across customs, across country and state lines and organizational differences between, who is shipping what where. Again, I think the first time someone in one of those offices sees one of these drug products, it's going to take them a lot longer to work through the logistics of how to get that where it needs to go. Same is true for receiving in shipping rooms in a hospital versus somewhere in a more rural space or in a different country. I think it's just going to take time to work through some of the hiccups with respect to logistics. But I think it's doable, and I think that we're on the right track.
Yeah, it looks like we're probably about 12 to 18 months away from, somewhere in that time frame, we may have several of these products going in front of the EMA. So at least from a European perspective, it looks like that's next for several companies, including Novartis, as you mentioned. We do have another question here that I'd like to tap into before our hour closes up. And it's one I think I hear a lot from different folks after CAR-T is, what is next for other types of cancers? Solid tumors is an obvious one that pops up in the questions from all different perspectives, and thinking about not just CAR-T, but, CAR-T lays the foundation for other cell therapies, some of which are being studied in solid tumors. Bruce, perhaps I can ask you to tackle this question first.
Sure. I do think it's an exciting time for CAR-T and the solid tumor space. I think that what we're learning from the hematological tumors, where antigen perhaps is much more accessible, is both dose and adverse event management. And I think those will both be very helpful as we move into more complicated solid tumor spaces. I am, personally hopeful that a single CAR-T would do the trick in a solid tumor disease space, but I'm not sure that will be the case. I do think there will need to be some sort of modulation of the tumor microenvironment to make it either more accessible or less immunosuppressive for an active CAR-T to work. And so I think that there's a lot of studies right now that are ongoing looking at combination therapies using checkpoint inhibitors and using sort of microenvironment conditioning regimens that might make the tumor more accessible to CAR-T therapy. So I think we kind of have a wait and see attitude, but I think we're optimistic that, again, that enigma of how to get a T cell that's targeted to a tumor antigen into the correct orientation in the microenvironment, I think that'll be cracked in the near future.
Great. Gwen, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, and I think this is what I was trying to get at before. We believe that the heme space actually is the avenue to a lot of what happens in afterwards in solid tumors, and so we're excited that what we're learning now could be much more broadly applicable, and we think that our research dollars are well spent in looking in the heme malignancies for translatability. But I think the point that we don't know enough about the immune environment and what allows someone, we've learned quite a lot about this from the checkpoint inhibitors. What environments and what conditions allow one patient who, from a clinical point of view looks the same as the next to respond to an immunologic therapy, and what patients need additional combination therapies in order to be able to respond, begs the question that has been brought up about what are the right antigens in any given solid tumor and are they accessible. But even just your ability to respond to an immunologic therapy, are there reasons why? Of course there are, and we need to understand those better, because I think that will make this therapy and therapies like this much more applicable and help us understand, for those patients who won't respond to just a CAR-T, could we use less CAR-T and alternative combination therapies that would be safe and effective for those patients that aren't going to be the single shot responders? And I think that that's going to allow us to get into the solid tumor space much more effectively. And even in some of the hematologic malignancies where the responses to single-agent immunologic therapy do not seem as promising as in the B-cell malignancies.
Michael, any thoughts on this before we close out our questions from the audience?
No, I think the previous speakers covered it. I think that, you know, kind of what we've heard today is that, you know, we've kind of crossed this Rubicon, and so the impact of these kinds of technologies in other types of cancers or with other types of tumors or perhaps other types of conditions is really kind of the exciting future, I think, for cell and gene therapy and for all these new technologies and the impact on patients. So I know I'm excited to see the results and to follow all these developments. And my colleagues here are more the researchers than I and clinicians than I. But I just think that what we're hearing today is that we're just really on the cusp of a next generation of technologies that will have significant impacts for us and for our children and generations to come.
Great. Thank you so much to our audience for joining us today, and especially to our panelists for sharing your perspectives and expertise. We had a lot of great questions that we couldn't get to today due to the time limitations. It's pretty clear, though, there is a lot to discuss, and we need more of these webinars to keep the conversation going. Just a reminder, the slides from today will be available to all of you who registered for the webinar. Thank you, and have a great day.